This is the brand new Sigma 50mm f1.4 DG DN Art. That means that this is a professional grade lens designed for mirrorless cameras, specifically Sony E-mount and the L-mount, which is Panasonic, Leica, and anybody else who might want to join. Today, I'm going to be comparing it against its closest competitors. You can see I have just about every 50mm lens here. I'm going to do a comprehensive, exhaustive review to tell you which is the perfect 50mm lens for your budget. Subscribe to see the exhaustive review. And today we'll compare the Sigma against the Sony 50mm f1.2, a more high-end lens, the Sigma 50mm f1.4 DG, which is their old DSLR lens, basically adapted to mirrorless, but with a built-in adapter, and the existing Sony 50mm f1.4. That's that Zeiss lens, and we'll find out if that Zeiss name really means better quality. But first, let's talk about 50mm. For about 100 years, 50mm has been considered the normal focal length. It has been the default focal length. And today, many people still pick up a 50mm by default as their walking around lens. I actually feel like, against the definition, it feels a little telephoto to me. My normal lens is more wide angle, but where I use a 50mm f1.4 or f1.2 is in a lot of portraiture. I like to get closer to my subject than an 85mm would allow, and I like the more natural compression of the wider angle 50mm. Plus, the 50mm f1.4 gives me lots of bokeh, that background blur. So I think this should be one of the first lenses that you buy because it is so useful for portraits and because portraits are where you really want that extra bokeh. For sports, any courtside game like basketball or volleyball, this is about the right focal length. And because those are so often done indoors in low light, that fast 1.4 aperture will make a really big difference. For events, things like a wedding reception, you might often go wider angle to capture group shots, but for things like the first dance, where you don't want to be up in their face, 50mm provides a good working distance while also giving you just crazy background blur to separate the people dancing from everybody in the background. Before I compare this against the closest of these competitors, I want to talk a little bit about this lens specifically. I love the new Sigma Art design. It features a physical aperture ring, so you can dial in the aperture before even turning on your camera. That also allows you to more quickly get ready by giving your left hand something to do. If you don't like that, if you'd rather control it from the body, just click that over to A and then flip this switch right here, and that locks the ring in place so you can't accidentally move it. If you're shooting video, you might want to smoothly pull the aperture. They have a little click switch here. So if I turn that off, now I can adjust the aperture without any bumps at all. And of course, it's got an autofocus, manual focus switch, and a programmable button that you could customize like AF on if you wanted to. The lens hood locks into place with that button and feels as premium as the rest of it does. You can see the finish doesn't quite match the finish you usually see on Sony lenses, but it still feels great. And look how nice and thick that manual focus ring is. Though I have found that the autofocus is reliable enough, I never feel the need to manually focus. Sigma has definitely improved their autofocusing from previous generations, and I feel comfortable trusting this with moving portraits, events, and sports. I'm going to do a very detailed comparison against the most key competitors here, including things like sharpness and bokeh. But first I want to talk about lens selection a little bit, because Sony allows Sigma to create this lens for the E-mount. That gives consumers more choices. And Sony does not charge for that. It's an open license that they've granted to companies like Sigma and Tamron. And that's why I have so many lenses here, because many of these are Sony, but many of them are third party. Like this is a Samyang lens. We have Yongnuo and Rokinon lenses, but you cannot get those for Canon. Canon has very publicly said they will not allow third-party autofocus lenses for the RF mount. But Nikon hasn't been so public about it. But what has come to light recently is that Nikon does not allow competing lenses from third parties on their platform. So Nikon certainly has a 50mm f1.4 planned for Z mount, which means this lens will probably never come to the Nikon Z mount. And that is really a shame because, spoiler alert, it's an excellent lens. And having these sorts of options is part of what makes Sony, I think, the most powerful platform for consumers. Certainly for those of us trying to get great results on a budget, the fact that we have more options is really good news. Okay, let's get into the different comparisons. And I want to start by comparing the new Sigma to the older Sigma. This is the new Sigma, and you can see it has that aperture ring, and it is just a little bit smaller than the older Sigma, which was designed for DSLR lenses and then adapted. But holding them, I really don't feel much of a difference. Like maybe the new Sigma is a little bit lighter, but finish and handling are essentially identical. The new one though has a lot of advantages. First, at least what I've been told is that it's $100 cheaper than the old one. And that seems wrong because this is so much better of a lens. The autofocusing is significantly better. The minimum focusing distance is about the same on the two. When I compared sharpness, I found that the new version is a little bit sharper in the center. I could see it in these 240 megapixel side-by-side comparisons, but if you were shooting a Sony a7 III with 24 megapixels, I'm sure you would never notice any difference in the center. In the corners though, it was a different story. The new lens is significantly sharper in the corners. If you're shooting landscapes, something where you care about edge-to-edge sharpness, that might be worth it to you. But I will add, those differences are wide open, and you'll see less and less difference as you shut the aperture down. So if you're always shooting at f8, you might never see a difference. Surprisingly, the old lens has smoother and rounder bokeh. It's also about 1/6 of a stop brighter. The t-stop is brighter. So you'll get a little bit better results in low light conditions. So overall, if you have the new lens, definitely consider upgrading. And if you're choosing between these two, if this one is cheaper, definitely get it. But I would say this is worth a couple of $100 more than the old DG lens. If you're shopping online, distinguish between them by looking for DG/DN written on the lens, as well as that aperture ring. Otherwise, you might get the old lens. Now let's compare the Sigma against the Sony Zeiss lens. The size and handling are very similar. Their bokeh was about the same. But the new Sigma and all the other 50s I'm talking about got significantly closer to small subjects than the Zeiss did. That's really important if you ever like close-up work. For example, maybe a wedding photographer who needs to get that ring shot. With the Zeiss, you would need to put on a couple of extension tubes to get as close as you could with the Sigma or any of these other lenses. Comparing the sharpness of these two lenses, the Zeiss was really bad. This is like one of the worst, most drastic differences I've ever seen. People talk about how great like the Zeiss brand is, but all the Sony Zeiss lenses I've ever tested have been really subpar. In fact, when we first started shooting Sony, these were the only options I had, and I would regularly just adapt Canon lenses rather than using the Zeiss lenses. There's absolutely no reason for anybody to buy this Zeiss. And if you have the Zeiss, definitely consider selling it and upgrading because the difference is going to be drastic. Now, I know it's a Zeiss. People talk about the Zeiss sharpness, and some of you are going to be saying, oh, you must have a faulty lens. But this lens came from Lens Rentals via Sony, and they take care of their gear really, really carefully. It's also not the first time we've tested this lens and other Zeiss lenses, and the results have always been similar. They're just not up to par. Now let's compare the new Sigma against the Sony 50mm f1.2. This is about half a stop faster, and that's a pretty big deal. That means you'll be gathering significantly more light, you'll see less noise, and well, look at that. The Sony is actually a little bit sharper. This G-Master design is really pretty remarkable. You know what else is remarkable? The price. This is $1,150 more expensive. Now, this is my 50mm. This is what I use day to day on my Sony A1 because I'm a working professional. I have a budget. I love having the option of opening up all the way to f1.2 when I'm shooting in low light so I can get that extra bokeh. And you can see there is a noticeable difference in the size of the bokeh balls. In real world, I really do shoot, especially portraits, often at 50 f1.2. The Sony G Master also got better autofocus. I just feel like it tracks focus faster, and for moving subjects, it's going to get more shots in focus. So if you are using this courtside for basketball or volleyball, it might be worth it to spring for the Sony. However, I did get good results with the Sigma. It seems to focus quickly, faster than other Sigma lenses. The minimum focusing distance on these was about the same. They got to about the same distance on small subjects. Talking about sharpness, at the center, at f1.4 on both lenses, the Sony was just a little bit sharper. I could definitely see the difference at 240 megapixels. I don't know that you'll see it on 24 megapixels in the real world, probably not, but in perfectly controlled conditions, it is a little bit better, and people who shoot landscapes and want the best possible results should grab the Sony. However, things flipped upside down when you look at the corners of the image. At the corners, the Sigma was actually a little bit sharper. For bokeh, those out of focus areas, the Sony rendering was just a little bit better. It was a little bit rounder and a little bit smoother, but the Sigma was pretty good. In summary, we looked at the 4 closest competitors, 4 autofocus 50 f1.4s for Sony, and 2 of them we can just immediately eliminate. The old Sigma, find a good deal on the used market, it can be okay. The Zeiss is not a great quality lens. If you're currently using this, this is good news. You could sell it to KEH or something and upgrade to the new Sigma here and get significantly better results in every way. The new Sigma really should be a default choice for most people, because I can't say it outdoes the 50 f1.2. I'm still going to keep my Sony GM50 f1.2, but most people will never notice the quality differences and should save themselves $1,100 that they can put towards other gear or education, like the stuff at Northrop.photo where we teach photography. This is definitely the best value of any 50mm lens. Thanks for loaning it to me, Sigma, and don't forget to subscribe, because we have our comprehensive review with over a dozen 50mm lenses coming up in just a couple of weeks. Bye.